In the previous section of this lecture, we talked about the adaptation of human beings to the different physical geographies of the northern and southern United States and the challenge of extending that organization westward. In this section, we'll look at the implications of this for the outbreak of the American Civil War. In 1789, the U.S. Constitution was promulgated, and there are three important features of the Constitution that bore directly on the coming of the war. The first of these implications was that individual states under the Constitution had the power to determine their own social and political organization, and specifically the question of whether or not slavery was to be allowed in that state. Secondly, however, the federal government or central government, and principally the U.S. Congress, made laws governing the new territories and the admission of these territories as states. And thirdly, since each state had two senators or two representatives in the upper body of the Congress, it mattered how many states favored slavery and how many outlawed slavery and promoted freedom in the balance of power within the Congress, and thus the governing of the expansion of the country with the creation of new states. Here is a map of the distribution of slave and free states in 1804. You'll notice that at this time, the 6 southern states that grew cotton and had a plantation economy permitted slavery, whereas the 7 northern states that were concentrated on the self-sufficient family economy had outlawed or were in the process of outlawing slavery. You will notice also the dark line in the southeast corner, which indicates the extension of cotton production at that time. There was, in other words, a rough balance between slave and free states. A balance that did not resolve the question of slavery versus freedom throughout the country, but enabled the two sides to maintain separate economic and political organizations, slavery in the South, non-slavery in the North, and thereby maintain their common commitment to membership in the United States. This balance was maintained by a series of compromises struck in the U.S. Congress that ensured that this balance would be retained. The first of these compromises came in 1820, when the congressman from Kentucky, Henry Clay, worked out the so-called Compromise of 1820, or Missouri Compromise, which ensured the entry of new territories as states in pairs, one slave, one free. And as this map shows, in 1821, this balance assured that there would be 12 states on either side of this division. Moving forward, by 1849, we'll notice that this balance was maintained, that with the addition of 3 additional states in the North and the South, there was by 1849, following the Mexican-American War, a balance of 15 states on either side. Note that the most pressing moral and political issue in American history, namely whether one individual could own another, was settled not by a decision on the question, but by a compromise which maintained 2 parallel separate systems, both operating under the U.S. Constitution. Note also in this map of 1849 the extension of cotton production, which has reached eastern Texas and is therefore sustaining the economies of these southern slaveholding states. Finally, we advance to 1861 and the outbreak of the American Civil War. This war was preceded by the election of 1860, in which the Republican candidate of the North, Abraham Lincoln, was elected president. And as this map shows, Lincoln's support was limited to the northern states, while the Democrats held the South. Lincoln favoring a policy not of the abolition of slavery, but its non-extension into the territories, and the Southern Democrats defending slavery and supporting a process of self-determination in the new territories on the question of slavery. The coming of the war, however, was not simply a function of this election, but rather of the limits of physical geography. For as you note in this slide, which demonstrates the distribution of states in 1861, the time of the outbreak of the war, there are still 15 southern slaveholding states, as there were in 1849 in the preceding map, but now 4 additional states that outlawed slavery, so-called free states of Minnesota, Kansas, Oregon, and California. The extension of slaveholding states in the South was limited not by the limitation on the production of cotton, not by the lack of enthusiasm for slavery, not by the decision of the southern states not to expand, but by the fact that they ran out of water. For you'll notice that the extent of cotton production at this time remains in East Texas. And despite the annexation of Texas in 1845, which became a slaveholding state and a member of the United States, it was not possible to extend cotton production beyond East Texas. A look at the rainfall map that we saw previously demonstrates why. The rainfall west of the line running through East Texas was simply too dry to support cotton production and the adaptation of cotton production and plantation economy that would enable the Southerners to populate the Southwest United States and thereby have sufficient population to gain entry as a state. By contrast, the self-sufficient family farm in the North was able to adapt to agricultural production in the modestly dry Central Plains, and then eventually to ranching in the far west, and as a consequence was able to expand population and therefore the creation of more free states to the west. The choice for the South was either at this point to secede from the nation or to wait the inevitability of expansion of northern states, the creation of a overwhelming majority of free economy advocates in the U.S. Congress, and eventually the outlawing, or what the Southerners feared would be the outlawing of slavery throughout the country. Facing this inevitability, they chose secession and eventually war.